Hi everyone, welcome to my masterclass series. I'm here with my great friend Eric Silberger, fantastic violinist. Eric, great to see you here.
Great to see you too.
Eric just finished playing the 24 Caprices of Paganini in a single concert last night, so he's full of energy.
We're going to be discussing something that neither of us claims to be focused on as our main thing, as a historical performance background. That's not something that either of us have. However, we both appreciate many of the concepts and tools of that approach and of many other approaches. And so we're going to be striving in this conversation to unveil some of the ideas and principles that we think lead to a performance that's both very personable or very personal to yourself, and also one that can be very deeply emotional.
I think many people are frustrated by kind of the ideological or stereotypical qualities of these terms. These are modern. This is a modern violin.
This one's been around a while.
That one's been around a while. It's a beautiful old instrument, but these are set up for modern playing. These are modern bows, and that emotional connection, you can't achieve it through just picking and choosing this fingering, that fingering, this approach. Like, those are all tools. And they have to integrate and they have to come together in a true aesthetic, like an aesthetic vision of the piece. So what we want to do is create an open forum where we can all exchange ideas on this. There's no right or wrong. I don't say that as just a cliche. So make sure you leave your comments below. We'd love to know what you think, whether you enjoy a certain approach or whether an approach doesn't make sense to you or whether you hate it.
We'll very often learn something along the way. Everyone's delved into certain ways of playing, and it's been very interesting because when everyone started looking back, as happened in the Renaissance, there's a lot of things that we learned.
So let's talk a bit about the opening of the G minor Adagio. And I want to focus first on chords and how we play chords. There's so many options with how to break this first chord, and then how that chord relates to the other three chords in this first little segment. So maybe I'll start by asking you, Eric, what's your take on how you play the beginning of this?
I actually change it time to time.
I was afraid you'd say that.
Sometimes you might just break them all kind of one at a time, or sometimes, or
yeah.
It really depends on the context of your emotion. So for instance, if you're starting at the beginning of this on a program, you might have one way of playing it. If this is your encore, you might feel it a different way.
Right.
Now, should the context and the emotional experience of a performance or a day influence the way you play? I personally think it should.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's what's so great, is that no two performances are ever exactly the same. If you have, for instance, those four notes, and some people will make the argument that you should think of those all as individual voices, as those chords develop and those voices carry through in the music if you track them in lines. Then how do you bring those out? Some people would say, well, don't make it obvious, just play the chord and establish G minor all as one kind of note that goes from the bass all the way to the top all at once. Some people would say, well, you need to bring out every individual note, and then it'll be easier for the audience to follow. But the degree to which you do that, how fast you roll, and all those different aspects, I think, are part of a larger picture. And for me, that larger picture is, what is the pulse? And that chord has to fit into what that pulse is. So if you have the harmonic lines as the guideposts, for instance, you have then the notes in between can be thought of as an improvisation. Mm-hmm. But then how does that interpretation of that approach then change the way you play the chords? So I like to look sometimes, if the chord itself isn't enough information, look at some of the other notes and the larger context, and then go backwards from that. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes it might change the way you play that first chord based on how you would want to play the second chord, or the second harmony, or the line as a whole.
So there is a tradition out there where that is a melody that is sung, and it's soaring like a singer would sing it.
Cantilena, they would say.
Cantilena,
yeah.
Exactly. And so that's going to influence how we play the chord. So if we just kind of zoom in on the chord for a moment, I could think of about like four or 5 main ways to play it. So maybe we can explore the merits or just the sound of each way of playing a chord.
Let's break it down. Yeah.
So I think the way that most people probably play this, including professional, non-professional violinists, if you just polled everyone, it's probably... So the old 2 and 2.
Along a certain tradition of playing in the 20th century, you would generally also break it fairly close to the frog. You wouldn't do...
Because then you don't have any bow left.
Because you need to save the bow division, and then you can sing the top line more easily.
So the way you interpret that top line will also determine how you break that chord, of course. So while this can sound interesting and rich and full, another way, a completely different way, you know, focusing on the bottom note, sol, sei solo, solo, you are alone, sol, G, first note of the, you know, there's a lot of symbolism happening here. So, and it lives somewhere out there.
Well, and the thing is also, if you take the approach that the improvisation's on the second beat, the second quarter note, you imagine that sound is still in the air. So if we have that, we play the next line. So that line, if you imagine it never stops, that kind of makes the idea of an organ almost, just that continues the sound, even as there is an improvisation on top of that line.
Well, this is the interesting thing, because this whole dichotomy of period playing and romantic playing is so false. Because, for example, if you have the Henrik Szeryng edition of this, and Henrik Szeryng very much, you know, there's none of this kind of, he's not a period player, quote unquote. He has commentary in the beginning of his edition, and his goal is, he was really thinking, how can I play it in an authentic way, ironically? Like, no Baroque person would call his playing authentic these days. But in his way, he was trying to be authentic, like, how do I make this sound like an organ? Which is not what they were trying to do at all back then, at least judging from the texts. But this is a very curious thing. Like, that's one way of playing very authentic. It's, you know, trying to... Like, how can I make this into an organ? So it reminds me of what Lawrence Lesser says, and he's one of the great cellists of our time, one of the great teachers of our time, and he says that authenticity, it's what convinces you so that you can convince an audience, and that's really what authenticity is. And so, you know, he's standing that term on its head relative to how it's usually used. But I think that's the correct usage. Like, authentic is what, I would say it's what works. And of course, how do you define what works? But it is that. It's, that works. Yeah. That's the only way it can be today. Another approach which I like, and I don't know many people doing this, and I got this actually not from a period performance person, but... And I think in a large space that can work because it hides the bow change, you know, with some of the reverb. I got that actually from Daniel Shafran.
So why? Why an organ? Why is he so tied to this instrument? Bach was actually capable as a violinist.
Yeah, he played many instruments.
He played many instruments. So he wrote this for violin. Should we be imitating the organ as a form of authenticity? So if we look at somebody like Tosi Spivakovsky with his Bach bow, he tried to really create an organ on the violin by actually being able to hold all 4 strings, which doesn't work so well when you're just pushing down on a modern violin bow. But he was able to, with this one adjustment in the frog, actually get all 4 strings to be played with a nice sound at the same time, thus creating that kind of organ effect and being able to play all the notes exactly as Bach wrote them, so to speak.
The violin is designed as a monophonic instrument, and there is the power of suggestion versus the power of like literal interpretation. But at the same time, as we know, Bach created different settings for the same piece. You know, there's a violin concerto can be played on the harpsichord, and there's different editions. They're not even editions, they're not arrangements. They're different settings of the same music in a different context. So there was a level of flexibility of one instrument influencing the other. So from that perspective, you could say, yes, let's make the violin sound as much like an organ as possible. Like that's the ultimate thing. And so Spivakovsky being...
He went a step further.
He went there.
He went there. and I think it's really great when you hear what that sounds like. Is that what your favorite interpretation is? Because then you need to recreate that bow and then try to recreate that interpretation. For me personally, and I think for you as well, we're not looking to try to sound as much like an organ. We're using that maybe as an inspiration, as one more data source, and thinking, well, Bach was an organist. When he was writing music for the violin, he was also a skilled instrumentalist on the violin. He knew how to write for violin. So how much of the organ was in the back of his mind just because that was his principal instrument versus the violin? And I think that's a very interesting question to just ruminate and reflect and try different things on. And I think by approaching this music with that perspective, it actually enhances the possibilities.
Yeah, so I think we can create a spectrum where on one side is Mr. Spivakovsky, who's like, we're playing all four strings, we're going there, just sustain everything. And on the other side is people who would roll every chord, and there are musicians like that. Then like you just will not even hear double stops.
Yeah.
And that's a way of playing.
So in certain circumstances, you could, for instance, do. But you could also be thinking, I want this to kind of go out like a bell.
Yeah.
So that first note might pop out a little bit more consonantly, or it could come out more like something coming out of nothing. And in this case, I'm changing the way, the speed in which I'm changing the note from each string to the next.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's one kind of approach in terms of bringing out each individual voice in that particular case.
I like finding these outer edges to see what's possible and what I don't want to do.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And what you just played, for instance, that was something, for instance, Ephraim Zimbalist in the 20th century, a student of Leopold Auer in that tradition, he never believed in going back, rolling back on a chord.
Right.
And you see another classmate of his, Jascha Heifetz, and he would roll back all the time. He'd do all sorts of things where he'd roll down in like the chaconne, for instance.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what's so interesting is because what Ephraim Zimbalist said was, well, I don't want to make it so obvious the audience can hear on their own. But everyone has a different belief on the degree to which you need to show and say, this is the important line versus it's there. Somebody will, with their own hearing, understand that. It shouldn't be, okay, I spent 15 hours trying to think about how to break this chord. Now today I'm going to do it like this. And then you go on stage and go. Because you're nervous. So the thing is, when you first go on stage, also, what is the meaning behind this music? What is the emotional, spiritual meaning for which Bach wrote this? I mean, was this a study for his son? Was this something that really was just conveying his deep love for religion and for God? Or was this something that he was just writing and he just felt, oh, this is what I think should be there, and it was a very natural thing where he didn't give it as much thought?
I do believe in this kind of religious approach when you're still learning. Of course, we're all still learning, but when you haven't developed something that you can call your vision and that you'll die on a hill for, it's good to imitate. It's good to try to understand why you like something you hear. How does it work? Okay, can I do it? And then you live in that for a few weeks. I like doing this back to back, like living in one approach, and then you move to a different apartment and you live in a different approach. And from that conflict arises where you feel. You arise from the conflict of all these people you admire, right?
Yeah, and this is something that many great violinists have tried doing imitations. Jascha Heifetz back in the day tried imitating Kreisler to the point apparently one time he was playing for a party and they had this record player and he was mimicking the way that Kreisler plays. And everyone thought, oh wow, he's doing a very good job mimicking it.
Yeah.
But actually, it was just Heifetz playing and he had imitated Kreisler so well that people didn't realize. And I don't know exactly how that worked or if this is apocryphal, but according to those stories, he was a master of imitation of those times. And I think, as you mentioned, a lot of this has to also do with just the way we learn a language. In order to actually understand something, you really have to go delve deep into it. You don't learn a language in a week most of the time. Very few people in history have done that.
And you can't learn it in a book.
Exactly. So you need to experience and go through that. And then at a certain point you say, well, I think I understand that approach to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. Maybe I should now understand another language. Yeah. And then when you then put all those together, you have a deeper understanding of the possibilities.
So let's talk a little bit about these moving lines. Yeah, and so in that approach, what you really hear is there's an importance placed on this cantilena line. Mm-hmm. It's not just an improvisation. And if we did... One way to not get lost in all these possibilities is to determine like just a limited number of, let's say, aesthetic sound worlds. Like I think these two were very specific ways of approaching these.
It was a dichotomy, a complete separation, but there's in between, there's so many
There's a lot of gradations,
yeah. Absolutely.
But trying to maximally execute one or the other, or both, I think that's a very good way to learn and to really decide what speaks to you and why. Yeah. Like Kreisler's recording of this Adagio. Yeah, so this... and Enescu would be even further on that.
You're talking about parlando of the left hand, in a way.
Parlando of the left hand. And you'll hear that there's a relationship between the articulation, the vibrato, and the note, and that it's one little earthquake. Versus...
And I think the value of the approach where you're having a bit of parlando is, in a larger space, how do you create the articulation and the clarity, but at the same time, the long sense of line? I've heard one approach somebody said to me once, which is that the greatest legato is either on the same finger, so you're staying on one finger and sliding everywhere, or in some cases, just the articulation, the speed of which the finger comes off, so you don't have something in the middle interrupting the two pitches in terms of the line.
You have the shortest transition between
Shortest the transition. So the finger is either moving off very fast, or it's moving down onto the string very quickly. And I think you can disagree or agree with it, but it's a nice way to look at it and try it for a while.
Another thing to consider is how bass notes are related to notes in the upper voices. Of course, the bass notes are very important in Bach. They often form a line, whether it's in the chaconne or many places in this adagio as well. A good example of that is in bar 6, where, let's say, there might be an approach that's or
Now but the thing is that when you make something too active, the problem is it starts taking attention away from that longer line of what you're playing.
But there are violinists that do, and it works for what it is.
But it takes away attention sometimes
takes
if
away,
it doesn't
yeah,
have
of course.
that separation in terms of the quality of the sound, for instance. So often when people bring out a bass line, they'll just play it louder relative to everything else. So
they're checking that box.
now the problem is those notes also can be phrased. So you might have but then we also have the harmony.
Right, of course, many layers.
There's many layers, yeah.
So looking at the score, it's actually very unusual that Bach would write out all of these 64th notes, even 128th notes are there too, right? You could say that in a sense he's kind of being very instructive on how to create these improvisatory flourishes. Like, what is the meaning of, like, why is there suddenly those two fast notes? If it wasn't there, would you have a thought to do it yourself? Like, ask yourself that. And then I think what we're left with the realization that there's definitely an improvisatory element to these 64ths and 128ths and beyond. And before, you would have figured bass, you'd have far fewer instructions.
And that's the argument some people make. Well, if he wrote this much detail out, maybe he wanted it to be played exactly as on the page. And then yet, if you do only what's on the page, that also limits the freedom of interpretation. And this guy was known for improvising and changing everything.
I think it's just
on the spot.
instructional.
Yeah.
I think there's a didactic quality to this. And I think he did write this with students in mind, like people that want to learn how to play the instrument. Not necessarily, but like just someone who wants to understand the possibilities of the instrument. I think he wrote it out for us. Like, here's one way.
I think by writing a collection of 6 partitas and sonatas, I think that also shows you he's showcasing the instrument in different keys, in different ranges, and different possibilities. So
absolutely,
there's a lot of definitely him exploring the instrument through this vehicle of these 6 partitas and sonatas. If you were to say you're still bringing out the bass line, but in a different way, because you're adding a little bit of speed and weight at the beginning of the note and releasing.
Yeah.
But if you're playing in a reverberant space, really the beginning of the note is what matters the most in terms of creating that attention. And then the space takes care of the rest. So even if you let it decay in the actual sound, even in this space, we hear a little bit of that reverb continuing the note. So we can actually start. And a lot of times when you look at some of the bows of that time period, they're not as easy to sustain at the tip as with our current modern bows. So it wouldn't be a big surprise to find people bringing a bit more attention, especially at the frog, and releasing a little bit more.
Absolutely.
I think that's especially interesting because if you look at a lot of, the arguments towards using open strings in music of Bach, for instance, sometimes when people had a violin made with gut strings, the open strings sound warmer, compared to a lot of our synthetic steel strings. You play an open E string, it's quite bright. It has a lot of high frequencies to that, which can stick out. And if you have, a string that's a lot more warm, you can use an open string and not have it kind of call out in the same way that it would.
It's more challenging to use these and make it, but we can do it, right?
We can do it.
I remember when I first truly understood that the open E can sound beautiful is when I heard Arthur Grimillot. And his sound is so magical that somehow with his bow, he was able to make the E string just sound like a note that's fingered on the A. Like it felt that round.
And that's all due to his ability to kind of have a certain sound in his ear that then he made it happen. And I think that's something that's really greatly influenced by having a vision of the sound in your ear and by experimenting until you have one.
Yeah, so that kind of drives the point home, but you can do this even without a friend.
Yeah, but something I just want to bring to attention is when we play it together, my first instinct is, okay, I want to bring out this note. But if especially you're playing in a very live space, you don't want to necessarily sustain it to the end because it can still be in the air while you're going.
So this doesn't work anymore.
That doesn't work.
So what I have to do is... So that necessitates a totally different aesthetic.
Now let's try a different way.
You know? Yeah, so the equipment, if you think about the equipment, the period bow, and what you mentioned about that decay, that natural decay of sound, we have that too, to an extent, right? Because the tip is just weaker.
It's lighter.
And we can use that to our advantage. So that can give you a clue of what's one of these yes moments of like, oh, that is a cohesive approach. And that, I think, following the equipment is a very good direction to go in, for sure.
Yeah, and one way to do this, play with the hand up a little bit higher. Even if you play without vibrato, just as an experiment, once in a while, don't stay there necessarily, but you could. Just move the hand up a little bit higher on the bow, and you'll feel a little bit more of what it might feel like to play on a lighter bow that was of that time period.
Another spot where the interaction of the bass notes and the upper voices is important is in bar 11. And so there are some options here, of course. You know, the way that you play this line, you know, there's some that they want to hold it. Alternatively, so I'm kind of hitting it, chipping it a bit. It's not, that would be too weak. It's kind of treated, I'm sending it out a little bit so that I can let it go and know that it'll be heard.
And I think something you're doing also is just, even if it's written out, what does that mean? You have the eighth note and you have the two notes happening at the same time. But at the same time, you also have the idea of what is that note as a function. So having it as a bass line, you can make it a bass line either by bringing a little bit of tension by a little bit of bow speed at the beginning of it. Or you can really sustain it a little bit more.
Probably a middle ground where you can, you know, if you wanted to vibrate the top line, you could still let go of the bottom.
And you can also release a little bit on the top note too.
Yeah.
Or
there's a way of playing, let's say, without vibrato on these double stops, where you're trying to find, for me at least, I'm trying to find the perfect intonation to exaggerate the dissonance a bit. And you can decide where you place this. just a little music theory, of course, we have our suspensions. The chord tones are here, non-chord. This aesthetic, you don't have to do the slide, but it's so different, and I can hear in the back of my mind someone saying, it sounds dead, it sounds cold, it's not vibrated, right? Coming from that particular aesthetic. And I'm trying to convince them that this is good, this works.
Well, I think they both can work, but it's a matter of how much bow speed, how much weight are you using at the beginning of the note? Or...
Right. Yeah, you can expand it with bow speed, or with this kind of, manipulating the weight, and of course then sounding point comes into place as well.
When have you been most convinced of your playing of Bach?
Of my own?
Mm-hmm.
All the time, obviously. No. When I achieve that, when I'm like, even someone who disagrees with me vehemently must say, like, oh yeah, that was kind of nice.
But when does that point hit you that you feel convinced of it as much yourself?
I'm listening for very particular things, and when I hear it, I'm like, yes.
So what is it in this particular thing?
Yeah, so for this, it's part intonation. Like, have I maximized dissonance but not went overboard? That's one thing.
And that's playing a certain note a little sharper, or...
Yeah, so I think both wider is the kind of direction you can attempt. Like, this is probably more correct mathematically, but it's not.
So it's like bringing down the flat, because this is
bringing down the flat and bringing the D a little higher. I don't think it needs to necessarily be a real D. It can be a little, because of its function, right? It doesn't have to be. It's maybe too much. Because we've already destroyed resonance. We have an E flat, D, a real D doesn't matter anymore. It's like, how does it interact with the E flat? Mm-hmm. And so I'm listening to that. But actually, I think a lot of it is right hand. It's mostly right hand.
So do you recommend ever playing this just without the left hand? Or do you recommend usually, because that's an interesting thing, is just trying to get the feeling, for instance.
To a degree. I think it works to a degree.
But then you need to kind of have it there, or else...
You need to have something real.
Yeah, otherwise it doesn't sound the same.
It'll feel different.
And the sounding point, when you start putting down fingers, adjusts ever so slightly, sometimes very differently. Not so much in Bach, because we're rarely going up this high, but it's very interesting for me that when you kind of go through these different approaches and come back, you'll find that you save time by going with certain ones.
Yes.
And for me, it's kind of something where if you just play the music a lot, but are always listening for something, you start hearing more.
Yeah.
And that's when good things start happening. It's when you start hearing the bass line, when you start hearing the melodic line, when you start hearing the rhythm and the improvisation. And so I think all the elements we talked about today, really, if you start just listening as much as possible, it kind of gradually opens up the sound, and then you find, I strongly believe in this interpretation.
When I'm playing, I want to show something to someone. Like, I want to call you and be like, hey, listen to this. And like, that's what I'm looking for in the music. Something that I could show to someone and be like, listen, do you hear how that, like, isn't that nice or ugly or whatever it might be? Like, I'm trying to sharpen what it is I'm looking for. I feel like if I can convince myself enough, and not like through trickery, but through like actual quality, then they'll get it. They'll get what I'm trying to say. I firmly believe it.
Yeah.
Or they have different expectations.
Or they have a different value of what they think it should be.
Like, I think if someone's open, they'll hear what I'm doing if I'm at my best.
You know, something in this music especially is it should never sound like it's medicine. And I think that's, unless it's food for the soul, not medicine.
A very simple consideration, but it can have a pretty big effect on your overall kind of sound aesthetic and your interpretation. Like, for example, in bar 3, So we have. How are you treating those? Is it a rocking motion?
And you know something interesting? You just did that with your violin too.
Yeah, it helps. Yeah, and you know the physicality, and this is, I think, why we're not going to get into setup, but having a comfortable setup is crucial, so that the instrument isn't entirely locked. Like, we play with shoulder rests. I disagree with anyone who thinks you can't have freedom with a shoulder rest, but I agree that freedom is important. So yeah, I would do that in. If I want to help get in the string, I want to move my instrument up to meet the bow a little. I don't know if you have the same
I
feeling.
find that it's very situationally dependent, but I think it's very good to be conscious and aware to some degree, when you're practicing especially, where is the placement of the violin? Mm-hmm. Because when you have, for instance, the violin a bit lower versus it influences your sounding point, because the bow automatically will want to come down if it's a little bit lower, if it's a little bit higher, and you're moving the bow or the violin alongside with each other. You're actually helping the sound to sometimes come out a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean we have to go like to that extreme.
Right.
But having a tiny bit where we're opening up on a down bow and closing up a little bit on an up bow does help the sound to ring and come out a little bit more. And I think especially with some of these chords, when you're having, for instance, you can help the sound just have a little bit more ring, a little bit more air and breath, just having a tiny bit of movement in the violin. Now, generally speaking, this would mean that the violin is going on the opposite direction. But we're talking a very, very subtle amount, because if you go too far, you see where the bow is, unless you really go way too far. So we only want to have a tiny subtle amount if we do it. And I think it's something that should just feel like it's opening up the body. So avoiding stiffness rather than creating a lock, and then we're forced to kind of be in a straitjacket. So this is just about relaxation in this music as well, so that we can also convey that freedom when we're playing.
Another important thing to consider with this music, especially if we're talking about different aesthetics, is how often you step outside of first position. Mm-hmm. That's something we're always thinking about when we're deciding on the color of sound. So let's just take two concrete examples here. In bar 7, so we have, and then you can do, or, so to my mind, that's important for avoiding an open E string. I think that's one of the main reasons. Also, I think it's done to have a descending quality to these 3, 2, 1.
Also, some people would say, when you want to keep the same line, keep it on the same string. So as much as possible, then if you have an open A string.
Right, avoiding the cross.
Avoiding the cross of string, and that, because the E string is going to be a bit brighter. Mm-hmm. So that would then be the reason to stay on the same string. And then you have an excuse for playing that on a different string, first of all, because you don't have a note that low on the A string, but also because you're now separating the note by having a bass line that's on a different string. So you kind of have the voices separated by color. Now, there's of course the argument playing everything in first position as much as possible. And some people would say, well, you look at a lot of the approaches of the time, people would try to stay in first position. And
why would they do that?
Well, because actually it just sounded better in first position. It was projecting more on the instruments of the time. Right. And using open A string, for instance, or an open string would allow you to project better in a space. So people were very logical. They were saying, what sounds the best? Well, when I play in first position, it sounds better. Now, if they have an instrument like we have now, you could do either approach and make them sound good. but you can't play them the same way. And expect the same result. They're going to be completely different outcomes. So we have to kind of adjust based on the color, if it's a bit brighter or if it's a bit darker. How does that affect the overall line?
This is a good opportunity to talk a bit about rhetoric and where rhetoric and language come into play here. And I find that there's kind of rhetorical strength in staying in first position sometimes. I think that's one of the strengths of first position. It's a spoken approach rather than a singing approach. I think that's an important distinction. Like this is like an afterthought. It's not part of a... Sorry. To take an extreme example, like that's cantilena to the fullest. And some people play Bach like that, and it's wonderful. But the opposite approach would be one where you don't, this dovetails with not treating this as a cantilena at all. Focusing on... and then, they're like little gestures.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, first position can work if you deal with the cross and the open string issue.
Absolutely.
With bow technique and et cetera, et cetera.
You can have different approaches, but you also have to have a through line for how they connect.
It has to make sense.
So it's not like, okay, here's one good idea, here's another good idea. I'm going to play this good idea, then I'm going to play this good idea. Right. You can do almost anything as long as they make sense between the two ideas. So there's a transition between the two that emotionally makes sense. It could be a completely different contrast in emotion, but there's still some kind of way that you're able to kind of follow the story. Just something to keep in mind when you're playing the last note of this piece for me is I've done this so many different ways. But something that always I love is just hearing that G. We started with the G, a chord. And how does that note change between the two, from the first note to the end? And then we have this open G, which takes us to the fugue.
I encourage you to subscribe to the channel and also subscribe to Eric's new channel, which I will link in the description. No one is doing quite what Eric is doing in the violin world, and I just really appreciate him joining us for this video. In the G minor fugue, there are many, many things to talk about. I want to focus on one thing, which I think is the most important thing, is how do you treat the fugue subject, which then starts permeating throughout the whole piece in different way, shape, and form.
So with it being in cut time, in 2/4, the pulse of this is often misunderstood. So how do you kind of look at this fugal subject in that context of the tempo?
We can think of how we've heard it played before as a starting point, if you're not sure of all the possibilities yourself. I think one way... let's say in the upper half, or like this. This up bowing that's very popular. And so if I can just describe what that sounds like to me, it sounds like the note, the theme is pushing off the first note, basically. And it just kind of gradually fades. And then there's another one that enters.
Yeah,
that's
another theme.
Another iteration of the theme. Another way of approaching it is to do exactly what's written in terms of the bowings, like not to change the bowings, to do things as it comes, at least in the theme. So, and what happens when you do that, the short notes become long in terms of articulation. The 16th notes, unless you're not going to do that, right? So the up bowing shortens those 16th notes. I don't think that's why people play it that way. They play it that way because it's organized in terms of bowings. It's a nice solution.
Yeah.
When the 16th notes are short, you get the 8th notes on either side of them could sound more important than you might want them to sound. So just getting back to your idea of pulse and like where is the, I'm always thinking, where's the impulse? Where's the, in Russian we say udarение, like when you're pronouncing someone's name and you're reading like pronunciation with the capital letters, so you know how to say their name, right? Where is it on this gesture? And I think when you do, there really isn't one. The whole thing is just kind of going down, and then another one comes. And that's an approach. Another approach, which historical performance people would maybe agree with me, it's that note. It's the fourth, eighth note that we have. What do you think about those two, which let's say are the most popular approaches?
Well,
maybe?
I think the main thing is if you keep it a little bit, you do that 2-up bowing. You might want to keep it a little bit shorter on the eighth notes as well. If you keep it a little bit shorter on every single note, and then you kind of keep it shorter on the 16th notes with that bowing, then it can work. It's not to say you can't do it a little bit more on the string and a little longer. You can still use any bowing and try to create it, but naturally, the tendency is, after you do it for a while, 90% of people will end up something that happens with this one. You still have that line. So you have to fight against the natural tendency to go. And because you have it in cut time, dum, 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 when you have those chords in the mix, it's very easy for the bow to just tell you what to do as opposed to the other way around. So I think, personally, I prefer I find it a little bit easier to then bring out the line as a longer structure, which then I keep continuously. You don't have to always diminuendo it the same way every time or to play it exactly the same, but the same structure can then be there, and that does tie it together.
Well, what you're doing, which works, is keeping it in the upper half, where we have a lot of control over articulation with the hand. You can do many things that way. You can make them longer or shorter at will, basically. Right?
It's a little bit easier. And in the middle of the bow, if you're able to control it in a certain
different,
you can get a great sound there too. The only issue is with some people with the bow, there's a natural bounce. So in the middle of the bow, just be aware you're going to have to make sure that you kind of keep a consistency of bow speed and sound and weight so that you don't have a...
Here it's harder in some sense to control the articulation because it's a heavy object and you put it in motion and then it has to fulfill what it's going to do. You can't interrupt it. So it's very good for these, it's very good for the swing of a stroke because it's so organic. Here you make it happen pretty much. You're making it happen. And you're deciding. So when we have this interpretation, I think what this achieves is it prevents eighth notes from sounding notey, right? If this is a caricature, but this incredible importance, let's call it, of the eighth notes. And when you make the short notes long and the long notes short, you do get an interesting... You know, and you can imagine like a keyboard player just riffing that off easily. For us, it's hard.
In order to get that architecture, it depends on both your natural disposition in terms of technique, but also it depends on how long you've done things. I've played this fugue so many different ways that, I mean, it could be...
Yeah.
You know.
But getting back to your point about like how certain decisions in physics will make you tend towards a certain way of playing. Like there is a way of bouncing off of those eighth notes that is interesting when it's here, when it's on the string. We think of a fugue as this architectural masterpiece, and that's what it is. It's this beautiful Baroque architecture. And I think for many people, they see that as a very kind of architectural means very measured, you know? And and then on the other side, some people play this with a lot of freedom, like in internal freedom. Like, that's an exaggeration, but even the subject has a lot of give. And that's, in some sense, anti-architectural, but in another sense, it really works.
Well, I think just one thing I want to add is also the tempo. You changed the tempo. You played it much
has
faster
to be
the
faster,
second time.
right?
So it's marked allegro.
Yeah.
And I think that if you play it a little bit more flowing, you understand why people do certain bowings. Maybe they just think, oh, this one feels a little bit easier.
Right.
But at the same time, it's sometimes good to do the opposite. So
For sure.
actually, as an exercise, I recommend sometimes that we try it. Or just switch the bowing, put it backwards. Are we now all of a sudden doing different things?
But in the end, you'd decide against it, right?
I decided against it that
against
time.
that particular.
But that's my point, is that
Sometimes it would show you something new.
it shows you something. If you don't try to control it, you don't try to have that same architecture. Generally, the down bow, in most cases, might have a little bit more weight in the bow, so you're going to play those a little bit louder.
Yeah.
Now, is that a reason to do it? I don't think so. I think the reason to do a down bow a little bit more should only be in the context of, well, if it were up bow, I would still want it to sound the same way.
Right.
And so that's why I think this was something Isaac Stern used to do, which he would say to somebody, okay, now do that up bow. Okay, now do that down bow. And he would just have them switch it up. And all of a sudden they'd be seeing, wow, I'm doing things musically differently. Wait, why am I doing anything differently?
Right.
It shouldn't be for a technical reason. It should be for a musical reason.
Absolutely. The Siciliana starts with this voice on the lower string. And so we're immediately faced with a decision. Are we going to sing it? Are we going to swing it? Are we going to speak it? And what do those words even mean? So again, the way I like to do this is, okay, let's define some extremes based on what we've heard, what we know, what we probably can recognize. There is a way of playing this. Where every note is vibrated.
Something like,
Yeah. And then there's a different approach. Right, we have these decisions. Yeah, on Patreon we have a monthly Q&A and studio class also. So if you want to discuss anything or you want to play and get feedback, you can always drop in. So encourage you to become a subscriber if you can.
there's often what you would call, singing music and dancing music. Now, you can definitely have some aspects of both present at the same time, but you generally have to go in one direction a little bit more than another. In this case, it is a dance. So I think by putting that in the title, Bach is trying to tell us, maybe don't try to sing it like that, but also, if you're singing it, you still have to have the feeling of the dance. So it can't become lugubrious.
First prize. First prize.
No, so I do think the bowing, actually, that I personally prefer is down, down, up. And the reason for that is because then you can kind of focus on the downbeat and the stronger beats in the dance. If you do, or, doesn't matter what bowing, you can, but doing an up bow on that note, sometimes people use a little bit too much bow. And so it's important to always be aware of.
So for you, it's bum, ba, bum,
Ba, da, 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 yum.
I think the up bow, the idea of the up bow is like this pickup
Yeah.
You know, so I do agree with you. You don't want something sticking out.
It shouldn't be the strong beat, is all I'm getting at. So
Yeah.
dum, ba, da,
Da,
but dum, da, dum. If like the entire thing's opening up,
Right,
then
I
it's
think
a different,
that's the idea.
yeah,
I mean, avoiding inorganic things. is
inorganic
always-
material. Something that I think we're both doing is releasing the first note. And I think that's very important to kind of just think about, is it with pressure or bow speed? It's a little bit of both. But also the sounding point. We're not keeping it in the exact same spot.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that in this music a lot of varying the sounding point. So maybe whenever you have a larger, stronger beat, that can also be on a sounding point that's maybe a little bit closer to the bridge, so it has a little bit more substance to the sound.
Along those lines, you know what I really like to do? I like to, when I experiment with all these things we're talking about, I like to free myself from the shackles of rhythm and time. And so, for example, when the theme comes back in G minor, experimenting with sounding point and experimenting with decay. I might do so I might exaggerate certain things that I'm listening for. Okay, how am I treating the dissonance? How am I treating the roll-off of sound if I'm doing a decay? And I find that it's easier to experiment with that stuff if you don't feel like, okay, I'm performing it, there's a rhythm, there's a tempo. I like forgetting about those things conveniently sometimes.
Well, and something else is also you want the dissonance to kind of go away, especially if you're playing in a reverberant location. So, like that's already.
Well, which note is the dissonant? It's the Szeryng.
Yeah. When you have those notes going.
Right. Well, so I think some people might do this. They might go into.
But that's a choice. That's
the academics would say no, no, no. But some people do it. There's this kind of. Like that scale almost brings that next thing into existence.
which
I think
you
is
can
the
do.
idea, right?
But then. But then you're playing that with a little bit more presence because
Yeah, for sure.
otherwise the dissonance from the previous few notes will kind of take away attention from that. So if you do, or depending on the addition.
Well, you mentioned dissonance, and I think in some ways of approaching this, like in the cantilena approach, I don't think this dissonance and intervallic relationship is the primary focus. Primary focus is beauty, connectivity of a line. So I think that's why in that approach, people are very comfortable to not decay this.
Yeah.
You know, because it's just about beautifying. And they actually want that G to ring and connect them to the chord.
Or somebody would even say,
All right.